If you ask any organization, they'll never tell you we don't have enough data. What they'll tell you is we don't have the right data, right? And data that can actually help you take better actions is what you're really missing in many instances.
Hi, I'm Matt Egol, host of the CX and Culture Connection, the podcast for leaders looking to drive impact by focusing on customer experience and culture together. I'm really excited to be here today with three of my colleagues with whom I'm collaborating on a new community called CX on the Rocks. Roberta, Jason, Suzi, and I are part of a network of CX experts that will host monthly meetings about topics shaping the future of CX. You can learn more at www.cxontherocks.com. Now, this is the second of several podcast episodes where I'm going to be talking with my colleagues in the community. So you can check out the last episode with Sean and Mark, in which we first shared our plans for the community and how the CX space is at an inflection point. And I'm really excited to continue the conversation today with Suzi, Jason, and Roberta. Thanks for joining. Roberta brings deep expertise in Lean Six Sigma, process redesign, and change management to her work in CX. Jason is the president of Bespoke CX, which focuses on combining your contact center data with customer feedback in order to analyze customer emotions and behaviors to determine next best actions. We're going to have a lot of fun, Jason, because emotion and data are hot topics on this podcast.
Absolutely.
And Suzi is focused on education and enablement, combining learning and change management to advance the culture. Suzi, you had me at a low with anything that had culture in the title. Thanks again for joining the podcast, and let's dive in. Roberta, let's get started on one of the things that we've talked about before in launching the community together is the need to help CX practitioners get beyond chasing survey scores and act as more effective change agents in their companies. What are some of the lessons learned that you focused on as disciplines like lean, agile, design thinking, or others have been woven into companies' efforts to be more customer driven?
That is an excellent question right now. I would say the top three things that I've learned or have seen that are best practices for companies that use various mechanisms like lean or agile or any of those types of change management methodologies is that the first one would be that you need to make sure you have the data. You need data to support your business case, right? Data is your evidence, just like as an attorney needs evidence to prosecute or defend. You need to have evidence to show what needs to be changed or what the true business problem is. And so getting the data is one of the toughest things that I've seen, trying to bring all that data together. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that later. But having data is the number one thing that I think companies need to ensure that they have for a successful CX program. The second thing is you're working with people, right? So it's human nature for us to be resistant against any kind of change. You know, just like changing your routine in the morning or changing the way you drive to work every day, it's hard to change. It's uncomfortable. And I think as a leader in CX, you have to recognize the human side of how you need to approach people, whether leveraging emotional intelligence tools, counseling tools, coaching tools is number one. And being able to be a strong influencer is very key in being successful. And then I think the last thing or the third thing that I have found that would be a best practice or one of those things that needs to be part of that conversation is it takes time. And leaders need to know sometimes change does take time. It's not going to happen overnight. Again, needing the data before the change and having data after the change to identify, has the change even worked for your organization? Did it improve call center times? Did it improve efficiencies or productivity? And it takes time. Lastly, and I know I said I had three, but fourth, if you're a CX leader, you can't take it personally. You can't take the resistance and the change personally. You have to continue to move forward and recognize that it's not you, it's the resistance that just, again, human nature has when it comes to change.
Years ago, when I was first starting out in consulting, one of the first projects I worked on was in the metals company, which I really didn't expect to be working in the metals industry when I joined a consulting firm, 30 years ago. But someone taught me something there, which has stuck with me as a metaphor, which is that when you roll metal flat, it bends back. It has a memory. So you have to keep rolling it flat, and then before it stays flat, and that changes like that. If you don't think of it as like, requiring reps, then the change doesn't stick.
Yeah, and I also think too, leadership has to recognize that and be strong in their resilience to those times when things start going back to normal or to a different way that they didn't want it to go to. They need to be strong in their decisions, and also there needs to be consensus with the leadership teams as well to support those changes. That's really interesting about the metal, because our human nature too, we just want to go back to what we know is familiar and comfortable.
Yeah, there's disruption occurs in a lot of different industries. I worked in the metals industry early on some projects, but then also a lot in the media and entertainment industry, right when it was first disrupted by the internet. And it was what you learn in those experiences. You're working with human beings, and they were very resistant to change. And while there's a lot of technology disruption now with AI and other disruptive things, it's not a new phenomenon to have disruption in business. It's just the pace of change is faster. And the human side of it is what makes it really interesting about how do you navigate change, with customer experience, employee experience. They're all about human behavior and emotion.
I was just going to add that you definitely need to have a methodology as well. Like, at my past experience at GE, we had Lean Six Sigma. That was not just a tool, but it was our culture. And everybody was trained in it, no matter who you were, call center person up to leadership. You were trained in it. And so that it developed this strong culture of continuous improvement. And I think when some companies just bucketize or silo CX into one particular area, it's not going to work across the entire organization if they're not familiar or understand that that's supposed to be part of the culture and ingrained in what they do.
Well, culture is it's a function of your skills, mindsets, behaviors, relationship networks of people in the company. And like when you talk about something like Lean Six Sigma, or I brought up I call them cornerstone disciplines, quality management, Lean Six Sigma, human-centered design, agile product management. They're ways of approaching work, the way people collaborate, the way they make decisions, and helps you foster a common set of skills and way of working in the organization. A lot of times when you want to drive impact in an organization, you do it through the lens of one of these areas where you're building a movement in the organization. I often find whether it's a customer experience effort or a culture change effort that's broader even than CX, that you start with one of these cornerstone disciplines as a way of building momentum. Like, for example, at one company, we used quality as the lens, and we drove $100 million in savings on the cost of quality. It was a bigger company because we mobilized 5,000 people across the organization to focus on quality, which also had huge impact on customer experience and on employee experience. But that was the lens. Other companies have used, human-centered design or agile as the rallying cry for the movement. Suzi, this is an area you do a lot of work in also around change management and education and enablement linked to culture. What are your thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. listening to Roberta, one of the things that I constantly struggled with when I was running transformation projects is that change always started with things going wrong, things getting harder, right? The numbers didn't look as good because there's a time of adaptation, whether it's for people using the technology, adapting to it, whether the people behaving differently, adapting to it. And so what we found was highly successful is we'd usually do pilots and we try to do comparative, right? One team run this way, one team run that way, or do A/B testing and that kind of thing. Because what it would do is it would stop the fear that the negative that happens right after the change would persist. And they'd be able to see the improvement come back to your point, Roberta. It takes time, right? New habits take time to build. So we found that to be highly successful. I think the other thing that Roberta implied but didn't explicitly call out was it's a lot about what's in it for me. When you think about bringing change forward, when you think about altering a culture and adopting whatever it is, human-centered design, it's agile, et cetera, think about what is the group trying to achieve. And if you link your goals, your approach, your techniques into conversations of, well, if you want to deliver more revenue, this is a tool that can allow that to do that. If you want to save time, here's a method you can do that. One of the projects that I was a part of, we implemented data analytics in our customer feedback. And by implementing that tool, we were able to reduce the amount of time from diagnosing what was causing the problem from 8 days down to 8 hours. That's tremendous when you can suddenly shrink the amount of time you're, quote, making that mistake or causing that disruption in your business. And that's, again, tying back to what Roberta said, that data focus and using it to sustain what you actually are trying to achieve.
Jason, to bring you into the conversation here, you do a lot around data and, leveraging different data sets from the contact center or other parts of the business. And Roberta started with data as an enabler of change. What are your thoughts on the role of data and how to leverage that for kind of continuous improvement in the organization like we've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. One of the things that I often run into is the belief that all data is equal, and that just isn't the case. And in order to make good decisions and transform from good decisions to great decisions, you actually need to improve the quality of the data that you're collecting. And that's often the case in many organizations that we work with today, is that we see that they're collecting data, but is it the right data? And is it data that's connectable? And is it data that's actionable? In today's day and age, what we find is that, Suzi mentioned this earlier, the data has to be actionable, because if it's actionable, you can cut the time it takes to get to that action from 8 weeks, 8 months, never happening, to 8 hours or even less. Because most of the folks that are handling data today don't actually work with the data, right? And that's a big problem. So often what we see happen is that data becomes this very mysterious, unknown quantity that people are trying to wrap their hands around. And when you don't take it seriously and you don't have a strategy against what data you're collecting, how you're going to collect it, and how you're going to connect it to improve your decision making, generally speaking, you're going to fail. And that's the unfortunate truth.
I'd like to, like I do sometimes in these podcasts, reference some other episodes that people may want to check out that are building on and talk about some of the things Jason's mentioning here. I'm going to put you in really good company here, Jason, because one of the episodes was with Neil Hoyne, the chief strategist at Google. And what we talked about, he wrote a book called Converted, and I had him on to talk about the book when it came out and talk about how to build a culture of experimentation. And one of the things that, and if you like episodes like this, I'd encourage you to like and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode like the great conversation here with Jason, Suzi, and Roberta, and others. But what Neil talked about that you triggered my memory, Jason, is start with the data you have and understand the data you have before you invest in marketing technology. He says, start with what the data you have and think about, like, if you go to the gym to work out, you want to get stronger, you want to work out, but you don't use all the fancy equipment before you put on your shoes and you go to the gym. You figure out how to get started, and then you can figure out additional things to do. But what Neil talked about is if you want to drive experimentation, you want to drive great analytics, start by understanding the data you already have before you start gathering lots of new data.
And I think that's a really interesting point, Matt, because I think what happens in today's culture in many organizations is that folks don't know what to do with the data. So they end up collecting as much as they can. And what ends up happening is you may get a number, right? So let's say NPS, right? Or customer satisfaction. You get a 70%. Great, we're at 70%. So what? The question I always ask is, if that data doesn't come with recommended actions of how to move that needle from 70 to 80%, then the data is not of much use. And that seems to be the challenge that, many organizations run into. Yeah, if you ask any organization, they'll never tell you we don't have enough data. What they'll tell you is we don't have the right data, right? And data that can actually help you take better actions is what you're really missing in many instances.
So I'm going to bring in other episode, which I didn't want to lay too many on you at once, but the other one I was thinking about was with Oded Netzer, who leads the Data Institute at Columbia. Oded and Christopher have this framework called quantitative intuition, which they talk about in their book, Decisions Over Decimals. And I did a review of Decisions Over Decimals, which you can find on the JourneySpark website, along with other book reviews. But we had a lot of fun talking about the book and their approach, quantitative intuition, which is all about asking the right questions before you dive into the data. In fact, Oded has this great quote, which is, rather than talk about data-driven decisions, you should talk about decision-driven data. What data you're gathering because of the decisions you're making, not just making decisions with the data.
There's one thing that I wanted to just touch on, just to bring this conversation full circle. In 2018 and 19 and 20, actually, 3 years, I spent researching the book Unbreakable, which is how to build long-lasting, unbreakable customer relationships. And we talked to some of the biggest brands that are most successful around the world, trying to understand the commonalities, right? What are all these brands doing together that they may not know each other is doing, but what are the things that they doing together that's causing their success? And I think it all comes back to how they perceive data and how they use data, how they collect data, and how they put it together. Because the secret at the end of the day is, how do you transform that data into a narrative or a story, and then take that story to rally folks around it? And then how do you drive action? And that was a huge commonality, because all of these companies, what they really did was had a strategy around their data. And the strategy wasn't created by IT or technology groups. It came down from leadership, right? And so they were able to then transform that into very distinctive actions and prioritizations and measure their success far more effectively. And that, in many instances, I think you can see the successful companies, they just do that better than all other brands.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, going back to companies have tons of data. Whether they know it or not, they have tons of data. It's just a way to bring it all together that they struggle with. But also, as a CX leader, you can get overwhelmed with all the different data points, and you could sometimes be blinded by where do you even go with all of it. So going back to what you said, Matt, is strategy and really identifying what are the business outcomes are they trying to achieve, and do they have metrics already clearly defined that they could then try to wrap the data around and be able to pinpoint where they could find that information is very key. And that's at that beginning, having leadership on board, having consensus, having buy-in across the business as to what's the problem they're trying to solve or what outcome are they trying to truly achieve.
Now, a number of us, all of us in this community, the experts in the community, have had a number of roundtable discussions, which I really enjoyed. being part of as we launch the community. And now the audience can find them at www.cxontherocks.com, but you can find more about the community as well as these roundtable discussion videos around the site, where I talked with my colleagues. I was only in one of the 3 discussions and really enjoyed watching the others, and now getting the other hosts on the podcast. And what we're going to do is every month we're going to host a discussion where one of us facilitates a discussion. So I'll talk about culture, or Suzi will talk about change management, et cetera. Roberta, I think your focus is more on like process improvement, and Jason around like data and contact centers, if I remember. So we'll each host and there's about 10 of us, 10 to 12 of us. So we'll host monthly discussions, and then we'll have breakouts, and you can dive into one of these areas, and then we'll all get back together and share. So it's a great way to spend an hour. So one of the things we talked about in these roundtables is the inflection point that CX as an industry is at right now. And Roberta, I think, was just talking about this right now, that like a lot of the industry is responding to this wealth of opportunity with data and analytics, which creates both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is a CX leader that's a change agent and a collaborator in a company can work with others around the company to advance business outcomes. And those are, those outcomes could be growth-oriented, cost-oriented, innovation. There's a range of things you can collaborate on around marketing, sales, product, and service, because CX is a broad area. The more important point is it's not chasing survey scores. If all you do is chase survey scores, whether it's NPS or customer effort or CSAT or whatever the metric is, NPS gets picked on a lot, but there's actually a bunch of golden metrics people use. The point is, those are useful, but they're not enough. That's something we've talked a lot about on this with other guests on the podcast, is you can't just chase survey scores. You have to build outcomes. But there's a lot of opportunity as a CX leader to collaborate with others to drive those outcomes.
Absolutely. I think, and that's the challenge, I think, that has caused a lot of change within the CX world, is that lack of collaboration. And I think what has happened in many organizations over the last few years, folks are waking up and realizing that data is super important. And if you own the data, you really own a big chunk of the conversation the brand is having with their internally and externally. And there's been much to be said about a land grab going on, where, within the organizations, they're fighting over who owns the data, which is absolutely the wrong conversation to be having. Because in order for a company to be successful, any company, they have to democratize the data and make it easily accessible to everyone in the format that specific teams needed. Today, in many companies that we go into, we start by understanding, okay, where's your data stored? Great. You have a data lake. Awesome. How's it displayed? Oh, we have these BI dashboards. Great. Okay, you have these BI dashboards. So you have a single dashboard with a single score that you're now parsing out and then driving to everyone. But that's not enough. That's just that is literally a razor thin understanding of your customers, if that's what you're trying to do. It doesn't give you the depth of knowledge that you need to make insightful decisions. And so there's been this sort of understanding, and it's a misunderstanding, that the data is the story. No. The data isn't the story. The data is just the data. It takes time, effort, and a lot of know-how to transform that data into the proper narrative that can bring folks together and mobilize efforts. And a lot of times that's not enough attention's being paid to that. And I say CX in the past has ignored that for more sexier sort of initiatives, let's say, as opposed to setting the foundation right. And I think that's a mistake. And I think we're seeing that now.
I think one of the points that we're all making here is you need to start with the end in mind and think about, like, what are the outcomes you want to drive? What are the, use cases you want to focus on, and then the data and the decision making aligns around that. If all you do is just create a better mousetrap for data and dashboards, it's really not much different than chasing survey scores. So I'd like to kind of tee up a question here for the three of you. Like, when we talk about outcomes and all the data you could use to link, your experience to your outcomes, there's a few windows into this. One of them would be to think about linking experience to business outcomes, like that people have KPIs already in the organization, like, retained revenue or digital containment or whatever the business outcome is they're trying to drive that moves the P&L, and people can then measure the ROI against it to link things more closely to that. That's useful. Another potential lens is to try to look at the emotions that you want to drive and get more specific about the emotions that you want. You can actually do research and build insights into the right emotions along the customer journey, and then evolve your customer listening and data to track that and build data around whether you're getting the right emotions, and then link those to your business outcomes. And the third thing you can do is to look at the brand attributes. So, like, what are the elements of your brand promise which connect your brand and your CX, and measure those things? Like what are the attributes of your brand? All of those are valuable. Love your thoughts about when we say improving data and better measurement. What do you have in mind? Are one of these three categories, a fourth one? Like, where are you seeing the value from better data and analytics against clear measurement?
Yeah, I'd add a fourth one. I think, just like when we're going from point A to point B, there's a whole bunch of routes we can take. And I believe a lot of times we look for the outcome metric and we don't look at what I'll call the operational metrics in the middle, right? How many people are switching channels at the point we want them to switch channels? How many clicks are they doing during that process? How many interactions are they having to get a particular goal done? I think a lot of times failing to check those operational metrics throughout the path is what results in them ending up in the outcome that we weren't driving for.
100%, Suzi. The Qualtrics has a great, at the XM Institute, they talk about X and O data and outcomes, right? So experience data is what people are thinking and feeling and saying. And that often gets measured via surveys and increasingly by mining unstructured data signals like calls and chat and messaging and email and things like that. Operational data are the digital footprints along the journey. These are all the metrics that you're talking about that are measuring the quality of the experience and what's happening along the experience. And increasingly, you can actually mine the operational data to predict the business outcome such that you actually can predict what they would say on the survey. And this is for the silent majority that don't fill out the survey. You actually can predict what they would have said based on the operational metrics.
This is a very interesting point, Matt. So I will contest this point with you a little bit. And here's the thing. What I've seen working with data, especially behavioral data, the correlation to an emotional experience has been zero. And I'll give you a very simple explanation. A person can spend a lot of time on a web page, okay? Because they're simply confused about the data information there, and they can't seem to wrap their head around it. And they're trying desperately to do so. That's a different person can be viewing the same web page and spend the same amount of time on that web page because they're really engaged with that content and they love it. And they're digging in deep and they're really understanding what it's saying. Okay. Both folks spent 5 minutes on that web page. Okay. Completely different emotional outcome as a result of that experience. And I think very, very often I hear this, what you said, Matt, more and more by organizations saying, yes, absolutely, we can use behavioral information to predict emotional states. I'm sorry, I've been working with data for a very, very long time. it doesn't happen. And the correlation is not nearly as strong as it needs to be in order to make decisive decisions based on how a customer emotionally will feel. Now, say, for example, someone channel jumps, right? We know if they channel jump, they're going to have a more friction-filled experience traditionally. So we can say, yeah, they're stepping into a known domain of problems, right? But that's not going to be enough to drive effective actions forward. You're just not going to get the detail and the robustness of data to be able to take it.
What you're highlighting is it's complex and the context matters a lot, and that the ability to build analytical models can't be overly simplified where you try to drive very high level correlations. To get a linkage with operational data to outcomes requires a lot more digging, a lot more modeling. You can't just do a surface level correlation and hope it'll work. By the way, the same thing's true with NPS. The correlation of NPS with outcomes is very low, actually. It's like 40%, right? Now, what I find really works, Jason, building on your point, is to start with emotion. And so, for example, I'll give you a client example with a consumer electronics retailer. We looked at their journey and we found there were 4 emotions you wanted at different points in the journey. And so the journey is, the peaks in the journey are where there's meaning and memory, where there's more emotion, right? We found that you wanted people to feel relaxed, supported, confident, and optimistic as they go through the journey. It's a bit of a crescendo from anxiety and a negative emotion towards positive emotion. And you want them to feel optimistic and confident about how they engage in the category. And then you become their ally, their coach on the journey. These emotions were tested through research. We found out what does it mean to create those emotions. And then we can dive into much more specific context about how do you create those emotions through human-to-human interactions, behavior, which is a culture intersection, as well as the digital experience you want to deliver. But we first had to build a deeper understanding of the context in which those emotions occurred and what are the right ways to measure them. Once we actually knew these emotions mattered, we had an 80% statistical fit. If those emotions were present, we got the right outcome. So we doubled the fit versus NPS, but it took a lot more digging and context before we could build the model.
Yeah, and I think from a person-to-person interaction, that's much easier to ascertain because people can adapt far more quickly mid-conversation. But in a digital experience specifically, it's a very, very, very difficult process. And I think many people try to simplify how complex that process is on the digital side. And I think what it does, it sets up false expectations. So many brands, they look at scores like engagement, right, as a measure for, anything and everything. And more engagement, the better it is. Well, more engagement if you have a problem isn't necessarily a good thing, right? And so context matters. And so I think what you're trying to say, Matt, and I think I completely agree with you, context matters. And it's easier to adapt in a human-to-human environment, but a digital-to-human environment, that adaptation is a much more complex undertaking, and it requires a lot more know-how than people seem to think.
A lot of the focus in AI, and I understand why, goes into automating and reducing effort and reducing time spent. Now, to be fair, there's some of it, earlier uses were around recommendation engines and things like that. But a lot of the near-term focus has been automation and time saving and using chatbots and digital containment. And what we're talking about now in the complex emotional environment is often it's a human-to-human interaction that's delivering those peaks, not a digital experience, which is the culture. Which is why culture is so important, because that's how your employees show up. That drives that experience. So a lot of the focus in, conversations I have in this podcast, if you want to see my podcast with Joseph Michelli, he's written books about, leading cultural exemplars like Ritz-Carlton and Starbucks and others. We talk, about culture and how it impacts the customer experience. I'm particularly excited to engage in the community together and team with you all on how to connect culture with the data, connect culture with change management, connect culture with process improvement. Because anything I do on culture is better if it's together with your expertise.
Absolutely, Matt. And I think, this concept of gamification is an interesting one where you motivate employees to focus on the right outcome, right? And and reward those right outcomes more effectively. Because a lot of times in business, we see that, and this goes back to what Suzi and both Roberta mentioned earlier. We talk about the outcome, right? But in order to get to the outcome, you have to motivate your team to act in certain ways along that journey. And this is where gamification can be really useful because you're rewarding folks, not for the outcome but for the steps that they're taking along the process. And again, this is a different way, a more in-depth way of using data, right? Drive action.
Gamification is a really interesting process within a company. The reality is some people love it, and some people have been gaming for decades. I think about contact centers, right? If I needed to make my particular metrics work, I would always find a way to game the system to make those metrics work. So, gamification can be powerful, but I think ultimately what's most powerful is the relationship between the manager and the individual. And what are the things that the manager is driving that individual to achieve? And back to what Jason said, I think you have to be very, very careful about the measures that you drive people to. Many of the companies I worked in, I was measured not just on what I did, but how I did it. And that to me is the connective tissue between the culture and the outcomes and driving the results. So I think it's a lot more than just the right measures. It's setting the examples. I would say both the leaders within the company, and that leader doesn't mean they're in the C-suite. That means anybody who's a leader in the company, as well as the CX team. One of the biggest skills I think we can develop is storytelling. Jason implied that idea about, what you do with the data. And I know Roberta's the same thing with the way she's described these projects, to be able to take the data and put it in the context of the emotions, in the context of the customer outcome, and the benefit to me as the individual team member / employee in delivering that. Then I come back to most people love CX because it makes their job easier. There's less friction. If I can make my job more fun each day, then I'm going to adopt those tools.
I think it's funny. We kind of come full circle to it's all about the human experience, really. At the end of the day, you can have data to support certain behaviors or to identify certain outcomes. But at the end of the day, you need to drive relationships with your employees and with your customers on a one-on-one human experience. And that goes back to that whole idea of emotional intelligence, specifically with leaders. How do you motivate employees? You need to know who your employee is and what motivates them. Because I may work at a call center, but I'm not motivated by that bell ringing every time a sale has been done, because that just is reminding me maybe a negative emotion of crap, I'm not doing a good job, right? So I'm motivated in a different way. I'm motivated by maybe the manager coming over and going, hey, what can I do to help you? Or what can we do differently? I want your feedback. So it goes back to that human design and emotional intelligence.
Or hey, can I pull you off? Hey, can I pull you off the phone for a little while and have you be involved with informing what emotions are around this project, right? My favorite leaders when I ran contact centers were the leaders who came into the office and said, I want to sit with your agents and I want to talk to them about what they're experiencing every day. They go out on the sales calls, et cetera. They know the business then.
These are people who really are close to the customer, close to the business. They understand where the quality improvements can be made. And you're tapping into the culture is about energy and the flow of energy. And you're tapping into the energy of your people. Like you talked earlier about democratizing data, Jason, and that's really because you want to tap into the energy and insights of all your people. When we're talking about human behavior, ultimately it's about habits of people in the organization, and driving change is about habit building in an organization, among other things. What are your thoughts about, as a CX leader or people driving change in an organization around CX, what type of habits and behaviors do you think are important to focus on cultivating in people to make more effective change in the organization?
It's funny. That's a great question, Matt. I think the one thing I've seen that's worked, and it's never been explicit, it's more been implicit, but truth, right? Be truthful. Be truthful about your performance. Be truthful about the organizational's performance, right? And it's amazing how truth has the ability to connect people together. And I think that's one of the things that is really important. And Matt, you'd made an interesting, when we chatted the roundtable for CX on the Rocks, you made an amazing statement. And it sticks with me. Just because you can automate everything doesn't mean you should, right? And there's some parts of the journey that if you automate, you take away your ability to create a closer bond. And I think be truthful, right? And be truthful if you really care about the customer, then would you be taking that action to automate that part of the journey that really takes away your ability as a brand to really nurture a relationship? And so don't don't say you care about customer experience, then you don't have these conversations because again, it's not truthful.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, transparency, which is what you're driving to, Jason, is being truthful, being transparent, but then also being consistent. I think leaders need to stay and be consistent in their message, in their approach, what they're trying to accomplish. And the last thing I would say is accountability. Oh my gosh. Accountability is key, and own up to it. If things aren't working, own up to it. If things are working, own up to it with your team, you know?
So what we're talking about here is the connection between strategy, operations, and culture. That your strategy is really about who you want to be, what capabilities you want to have. That I learned when I was at Booz and Company, which became Strategy, and later when PwC acquired it, we had to rebrand it. That strategy was capability driven. Its strategy is about who you are versus where you want to play, which means you focus on capabilities. And operations is how you make the capabilities real, and the way you organize and process and tech and data, bring your capabilities to life. But culture is key too, because the way your people behave bring your brand promise to life. It brings your strategy to life. And if you don't have alignment around your culture and your strategy operations, your business is swirling, it's fighting itself. So, one thing you could easily do if an audience, if you want, we have a culture diagnostic toolkit. It's very easy to administer, that you can see how aligned your strategy and your culture are, and what behavior, what the cultural characteristics are for your organization, and how aligned they are to better, faster, and cheaper, through your value proposition. And then that gives you a starting point to engage in conversations with experts like we have here around what do you do about it. But a starting point would be, what is my culture today? How aligned is it to my strategy? Do my customers see those attributes of what I'm trying to bring to bear happening?
So great question and comments, team, on the culture. We talk a lot about, we expect cultures to have empathy, to have data orientation, to be collaborative. All of those things are really important to deliver better customer experience. What I find is one attribute that a lot of times we don't talk about is curiosity. If you have a culture of curiosity, then people are more adaptable to the idea of change, because they're asking, why is this customer calling me? What do they in particular need? Why is my product something that people want to buy? What is the data telling me around that? So I find that leaders who encourage curiosity and don't stifle that interest to find extra time to research and understand what's happening actually create the change that they're looking for and inspire the customer service and customer experience that matches their brand.
If you'd like to learn more about the culture diagnostic, just give a call. or reach out on LinkedIn, and we can have that as a starting point for the conversation. And I'd also encourage you again to go check out www.cxontherocks.com if you want to check out some of the other content there, or just sign up to join the community and become part of the conversation yourself. Join our monthly meetings in the new, in 2025. You can find more information on the site, and we really hope to see you there. Team, anything else you want to share with the audience before we declare victory today for the podcast?
I think I would just recommend, as a CX leader, find your community, find some support, find some people to help and be your sounding board outside of the company. That's where CX Rocks comes in with the community, and you'll find help and support and best practices and advice.
And I would just simply close by adding data matters. And if you want to learn more about the influence data and how to collect the right data, how to stitch together, join us on CX on the Rocks. We'll talk about that lots over the next 12 months.
I know that you've all sparked some great ideas for me. I know you have for the audience. I'm thrilled to be partnering with you on the community together, and looking forward to, thanks for taking the time to share your perspective with the audience today. And I know they'll get a lot of value out of talking to you all as part of the breakouts that we're going to do in the community, and looking forward to our first session with the community coming up. Thanks, everybody.
Great.
Thank you.